I think that all Jews are survivors of the Holocaust, because after all, Adolf Hitler's plan was to annihilate every single one of the Jews. And so I think that just as all of us have to understand that we too came out of Egypt, we have to understand that all of us came out of Auschwitz. And that understanding should in fact inform our actions and our lives, all the days of our lives. And as Mrs. Lux Brown has done so valiantly for us and also for her family, we must teach it to our children and ensure that they teach it to their children, because it is only through the knowledge of what we have gone through as Jews and persevered as Jews that we will ensure our future as Jews. I think it's important for us to realize that the Shoah only ended when the Allies won their war against Germany. And as a consequence, because it went on for so long, the Jewish people were the biggest losers of World War II. Not the Germans, not the Japanese, it was the Jewish people. We lost a third of our members. No other nation lost as much in World War II as the Jews. We didn't win the war, we lost it. And it's important for us to remember that so that we understand well what happened to us and how to prevent it from happening again. The Jewish people have lots of different responses to the Holocaust, a lot of different ways of looking at it. But I think that it's important, first of all, to think about how the Allies thought about the Holocaust if we are to really understand what responses we needed, what responses we still need today when we recognize that every single one of us is a survivor of the Holocaust. When I say that in the end the Shoah ended when the Allies beat the Germans, we have to ask ourselves, why is it that the Americans and the British didn't do anything to stop the destruction of the Jewish people in Europe? They could have done a lot. They could have ended it. The Hungarian Jews, survivors who lit the candles this evening, and so many more of them, the annihilation of Hungarian Jewry was essentially carried out before the version in those days of the evening news. Everybody knew it was happening. Everybody knew about the deportations to Auschwitz. It was happening on prime time. Could have been stopped. Why didn't they stop it? Why didn't they bomb the railroad tracks to Auschwitz? Why? Why didn't they bomb Birkenau? Why? The answer is twofold, I would think. The first reason is that they didn't think that it was in their interest to do so. They were fighting a war, a big war against the Germans, who they considered threatened them. They were doing it for themselves, not for us. They were doing it because they rightly assessed that a German victory would destroy their way of life in Britain, and in America, and in the rest of the world. But they didn't have a stake in the survival of the Jewish people, they didn't think, and they didn't think that there was any reason, when they're in the midst of such a massive war effort, to divert any resources to save people who weren't part of their army. That was their right to think that. We can be angry about it, and we can think that and rightly judge them to have failed morally in the test of their times, and that's true. But they had a rational view of the world, and it was what informed their decisions, and they also had another thing, which I think we shouldn't ignore, which is, at best, an indifferent opinion of the Jewish people, and probably more honestly, they didn't like us very much. So, and these were the Allies. Of course, we know that the nations of Europe, most of them, were only too happy to collaborate with the Nazis. The largest percentage of a Jewish population that was destroyed by the Nazis was actually in Holland, where you had massive collaboration with the Nazis on the part of the locals. But in most of the European nations, the people that were defeated, occupied by the Nazis, didn't have any problem collaborating with the Nazis in their joint project of sending the Jews to the gas chambers. So the Allies didn't think it was in their interest to save the Jews, and they didn't like us very much. So they didn't save us. And so in the end, the camps were only liberated when they defeated the German army on their terms in their time. So after they did that, and thank them very much for doing so, but they did us no favors, the Jewish people, the survivors, and the survivors who directly survived, and the rest of them who had never directly felt the weight of the German war machine on their backs, came up with a lot of different conclusions about what the Holocaust meant for the Jews, what behavior that crime against us, first and foremost, taught us about how we should behave in the world. And I think that it's worth considering two of them. There were two sort of schools of thought amongst the Jews about how to deal with what had just happened. The first one was outward looking. It said the problem with the Holocaust was that people didn't feel obligated to prevent it or from stopping it, ending it in the middle. Roosevelt didn't feel that he had to stop it. There was no way to force him to do it. There was no way to force him to bomb the railroad tracks to Auschwitz. There was no way to get him to bomb the gas chambers, and so he didn't. We have to change the law. We have to change the way that people look at the goals of war by changing the law. If we change the law, then people will be forced to protect us. So that school of thought developed the concept of human rights, the UN Charter, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Convention Against Genocide, the Geneva Conventions. They said if we educate people in the ideals of human rights, universal rights of humanity, the universal 10 Commandments, if you will, then we'll be safe. Because the law will protect us. People will follow the law, and they'll do the right thing, and they'll prevent genocide because they'll be obligated to do so. Couldn't convince him through moral argumentation. We couldn't convince him with rabbis marching on Washington. We couldn't convince him by appealing to his better angels. So now we're going to force the Roosevelts of tomorrow, the Churchills of tomorrow, to stand up and defend people like the Jews of Europe by putting together a legal regime of human rights law that is going to protect the victims. The other school of thought was inward looking. They said, we can't change humanity. Human nature is what it is, for better or for worse. People are good, people are evil. That's their business. Our business is to make sure that they don't have the power to hurt us anymore. Our responsibility to the legacy of our victimization is to be strong, is to build our country, to build our army, to ensure that we can defend ourselves, we can protect ourselves. We don't have to ask anybody for any favors. We'll have our army, we'll have our guns. Nobody needs to feel sorry for us. We can take care of ourselves. And that inward-looking response, of course, was a Zionist response. It was a response that actually had been born 80 years before the rise of Hitler, with the dawn of modern Zionism in the 1870s in Europe. And by the time the Holocaust began, the state of Israel was already well on its way to being built. So we had that solution on the ready, and indeed, in the aftermath of the Holocaust, much of the remainder of European Jewry came to the land of Israel on Aliyah, 1948, and of course 1 million Jews who were forced to run away from the Arab lands were able to make their home in Israel as well. And since then, Israel has become, over time, the largest Jewish community now in the world, outstripping the United States in the last decade. There are some 6 million Jews in Israel, and it is the most vibrant Jewish community, the most vibrant Jewish place in the history of the world. More Jews in Israel learning Torah, living a Jewish life, being educated in Jewish history than at any time in our history. Israel is one of the fastest growing economies in the world, and it is one of the strongest countries in the world. And so I would say that the inward-looking solution has, in the balance, been an extraordinary success. The Jews are in a situation today that we never were in since the destruction of the Second Temple, and we are in a position to defend ourselves in Israel and throughout the world as a result of the power that we have built up for ourselves. And what about the world? Where is the world today? Has it changed in the 66 years that have passed since the liberation of the death camps? If so, how? Has the idea that the human rights regime that was instituted in the aftermath of Auschwitz been borne out by events? Do people now feel more of an obligation to defend the weakest people in the world from the stronger ones? No. But as was the situation then, people are very happy to talk about how important it is to do so, as they do nothing, as we saw, for instance, in Rwanda in the 1990s, as we see today in Darfur, in Sudan, as we see today in Syria, with Assad butchering his own people in front of cell phone cameras. And what about the way that the nations of the world look at the Jews? Today, as in the 1930s and 40s, we have full nations. In fact, we have over 50 nations, members of the Organization of the Islamic Conference, who are, by and large, in agreement that Israel has to be obliterated, wiped off the map, just as Ahmadinejad has promised to do. We have hundreds of millions of people surrounding Israel who have been raised to believe that it is their duty to bring about the destruction, the annihilation of the Jewish state and the Jewish people. The ideology of the Islamic jihadists and their secular fascist friends is not that different from our perspective than the ideology of the Nazis. The only difference is that they believe that God is telling them to kill us, whereas the Germans believe that the Fuhrer was telling them to kill us.